The sky was clear that morning, and people were living their normal lives, and the world was quiet in its own noise. But then the peace broke when a dark shadow fell over the city, and people looked up and saw something they had never seen before. Because high above in the sky there was a massive ship floating without wings and without sound, and it was not from Earth. The ship was not moving, and it just stayed still like it was watching, and everyone on the ground was watching it back, and no one knew what to do because it did not attack, and it did not move, and it did not speak. For the first few minutes all the governments of the world started to talk, and satellites turned and fighter jets flew near, but the ship did not react, and people started to fear because silence can be louder than war. Then a message came, not through sound, but through every screen on the planet. And it said just 5 words, and the message was simple and soft, and it said, "We seek shelter, not war." Panic grew in some places and hope rose in others, and some people cried because they thought the world was ending, and others prayed because they thought it was a test. But in one special base under the mountains, a man named Captain Ray was called into a dark room and shown the message again. Captain Ray had seen many strange things in his life because he had worked for the special unit that dealt with secrets the world was not ready to know, and he had fought in wars that never reached the news. But this was something new and different, and deep down he felt something he had not felt in a long time. General gave him orders, and those orders were clear and cold, and he was told to board the alien ship and find out what they really wanted. And if they were a threat, then the mission was simple: remove them without delay. Ray did not ask many questions because he knew there would be no answers, and so he suited up and got into the transport pod that would take him up, and as the engines hummed and the light filled the cabin, he closed his eyes and thought of his daughter who used to wait for him by the window before she died, and he promised her that one day he would be a man worth remembering. Ship opened a small gate and let him enter, and that was the first strange thing because they let him in alone and without a fight, and inside the ship it was quiet, and the walls looked alive, like they were breathing slowly, and the lights were soft like stars blinking in water. Walked slowly and held his scanner tight and looked around and followed a voice that was not loud but clear, and the voice was coming from the center of the ship, and it was singing a lullaby in a language he did not understand, but it still felt warm. He turned a corner and stopped because in front of him was not an army and not a monster, but a tall alien woman sitting beside a small child, and they were holding hands, and the child was asleep, and the woman looked up at Ray and her eyes were full of something he had not expected. She stood slowly and raised her hand not to attack but to greet, and she said something that his translator turned into English, and the words were calm and simple, and she said, "Please do not be afraid, we are not here to hurt." Ray looked at the child and then at her and asked why they came, and the woman told him that her world was gone and her people were hunted, and she had escaped with her daughter, and they had nowhere else to go, and she said Earth was the only place left with hope. Before Ray could speak, his gums buzzed and the voice of the general came through, and the words hit hard because he was told to follow the protocol and deport the alien immediately and not ask questions because risk was too high. Ray looked at the woman and then at the little girl who had now woken up and was looking at him with wide eyes full of fear and wonder, and she stood up and walked to him and held his hand with her small cold fingers, and she said in a tiny voice that was full of truth, "Please, mister, don't take my mommy." Time stopped for Ray in that moment, and the world outside the ship felt far away, and he saw his daughter's face in the girl's eyes, and he saw the war in the mother's silence, and he knew that his next step would not be part of any order. The ship was quiet again, and outside, Earth waited for his answer, and the alien child did not let go of his hand. Somewhere in deep space, something else was watching. Ray stood frozen in place while the little alien girl held his hand with quiet fear in her glowing eyes, and her tiny voice still echoed in his ears as she said, "Please, mister, don't take my mommy." And something inside Ray that had been asleep for many years started to wake up. He looked at the mother who stood tall and calm, but behind her calmness, he could see the sadness of someone who had lost too much and had run too far, and he thought about how much pain she must have carried while protecting this little child through space and across galaxies, just to stand here and ask for mercy from strangers. Combs buzzed again, and the voice on the other end was sharp and cold, and it reminded Ray that he was not just a man standing in front of a scared child, but a soldier with orders and duty and responsibility. And the general repeated the command with no emotion in his tone and said, "Remove the alien." Now this is not a discussion. Ray stayed silent for a few seconds and then slowly moved his hand away from the child's grip and turned to face the wall, where his scanner was flashing red and showing a signal from Earth Control asking for a status update, and he knew they were watching him and waiting for him to act and confirm that the alien woman would be taken away. But Ray's heart was louder than the signal, and his thoughts were not clear because the face of his own daughter kept appearing in his mind, and she too had once held his hand and begged him not to go, and that memory was a wound that had never really healed, and now it was bleeding again. He took a step back and spoke, quietly asking the alien woman one question, and he said, "Why did you choose Earth?" And the woman looked at her daughter and then back at him and answered with a soft voice that held the weight of 1,000 stars. And she said, "Because Earth still dreams, and dreams are the last place where peace can live." Ray did not fully understand her words, but something in them touched him deeply and made him question the voice in his ear and the orders in his head. And he turned off his comms for a moment, and the silence that followed was like a deep breath. After drowning for too long, the little girl sat down near her mother and pulled something from her pocket, and it was a small glowing stone that floated above her hand, and Ray stared at it in awe because it pulsed with light and warmth, and he could feel its energy without touching it. And the girl smiled shyly and said, "This is home, this is what we carry." Ray knelt down to her level and asked, "What do you mean?" And she replied, "This stone remembers our world, and it sings to the stars so we never forget." And Ray listened carefully and realized he could faintly hear a gentle hum like a song lost in time, and it made his heart ache without knowing why. Suddenly, the ship's lights flickered, and Ray's scanner lit up again with a new warning, and it showed that Earth Command had activated remote override and that backup forces were on their way, and Ray had only minutes before the base security team would arrive to take over the mission, and he knew they would not listen, and they would not care about lullabies or glowing stones or tiny voices begging for mercy. He stood up and looked at the mother, and then at the child, and he knew he had to choose now, because once the others came, he would lose the chance to do what felt right, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached into his suit and pulled out his emergency override key and inserted it into the ship's control panel. Alien Mother watched him with calm eyes, but she did not stop him, and the ship responded to his touch and opened a hidden chamber, revealing a small pod just big enough for one adult and one child. And Ray whispered to her, "Get ready to run, because they won't wait, and they won't ask questions." She nodded and began packing a small bag while the girl stood beside Ray and looked up at him with wide eyes that trusted too easily and loved too quickly. And Ray wondered how something so pure could survive so much darkness and still smile. Scanner blinked again, and a red alert flashed showing that the security team had arrived at the base entrance and were preparing to breach, and Ray knew he had only seconds left, so he sent a false signal to Earth Command claiming that the alien mother had become violent and that containment was complete and the situation was under control. He hoped it would buy him just enough time, and as the pod doors closed behind the mother and child, he activated the launch and watched as they disappeared into a hidden exit that led to the far side of the valley, where no satellite could see. Alone in the ship, Ray exhaled for the first time in what felt like years and slowly turned his comms back on as the general's voice came through again asking for status, and Ray answered with a flat voice, saying, "The target is gone, but I am still here." In the silence that followed was filled with more than just sound, because Ray knew now that his real mission had just begun. The desert wind was dry and silent as the small escape pod slid beneath the sand like a shadow forgotten by time, and inside the hidden shelter built long ago by those who feared what never came, the alien mother and her child waited in the dim light while Ray stood above with a heavy heart and a silent mind. He had lied to his command and broken orders that were never meant to be broken, and now he was alone between two worlds, one that gave him orders without mercy and one that held a secret too deep to ignore. Ray had sent the mother and child here before the backup team arrived and erased all traces of the pod's trail, and he had stayed behind just long enough to make the lie believable. But the moment he returned to his quarters, he knew eyes were on him, and he felt the cold gaze of his superiors piercing his back even when no one was in the room. Sat alone in the debrief chamber as questions were thrown at him one after another, each one sharp and fast like bullets of doubt, and he gave answers that meant nothing because he knew the truth was too dangerous to speak. The general did not believe him, and Ray could see it in the way his jaw stayed tight and his fingers tapped the table like a man holding back a storm. And then without warning they showed Ray something he did not expect, a file not yet public, a secret even to him. File showed images of other aliens, not just the mother and child, but many others from past years, hidden and covered up by governments across the world, and every one of them had one thing in common: glowing stones, like the one the little girl had shown Ray in her palm. Each stone was different in shape, but the light was the same, and scientists had studied them secretly and found energy patterns that did not match anything from Earth or the known universe, and they called it memory energy, a form of living data that carried emotions, feelings, and history within. Light. Ray leaned forward trying to understand and asked why no one had told him, and the general replied with eyes that had seen too much and said, because even among us there are secrets we cannot control and truths we cannot allow. He was dismissed with no clear threat, but with a warning in the general's voice that whispered louder than any order, and Ray knew his time was short and his actions had started something that would not end quietly. He returned to the desert hideout 2 nights later under cover of darkness, using an old route only known to retired agents and smugglers, and when he stepped into the shelter he found the mother standing by a small fire holding the stone again and whispering to it like it could hear her. And maybe it could. The girl was asleep, curled up with a soft cloth over her, and the stone's light danced gently across her face like stars singing bedtime songs, and Ray watched quietly until the mother turned and spoke without fear, saying, "They will come for her, won't they?" Ray nodded and sat beside her and asked again what the stone really was, and this time she did not hide her truth and told him, "The stone holds the last breath of our world, and in it are the memories of my people and their hopes and pain and love and dreams. And if the stone breaks, then everything is lost forever." She told him that her daughter was born with a rare bond to the memory stone, and that bond was the reason the enemy hunted them, because the girl could access more than just memories. She could feel them and shape them and send them like messages across space and time. And that kind of power was feared by those who ruled through silence and fire. Ray listened without blinking and felt a weight fall upon his shoulders, heavier than anything he had ever carried, and he realized that this child was not just a refugee. She was a message, a spark, a living history that could awaken something far bigger than any war. The mother looked at him and asked why he had helped them, and he struggled to find words, and then said, "Because once I had a daughter who also believed in stars, and when I lost her, I thought all the light had gone too." For a moment the silence between them was not empty, but full of something neither could name, and the fire cracked gently, and the memory stone pulsed brighter as if it understood. Then suddenly the shelter's old sensors beeped weakly, and a signal flashed across Ray's wrist monitor, showing movement near the ridge, and not human movement, something different. And Ray stood up fast and grabbed his gear and whispered to the mother, "Hide the girl now." He stepped outside into the cool night where the stars above looked peaceful and quiet, but Ray knew better, because something had followed him or found them, and it was only a matter of time before the hunter arrived behind him. The stone pulsed again, And the girl stirred in her sleep, and somewhere far above the earth, something ancient began to wake. The wind carried dust across the open desert, and the stars above looked down without blinking, as if they already knew what was about to happen. And Ray stood near the entrance of the old shelter, with his eyes locked on the movement near the distant ridge, and his breath steady, but his heart heavy. He scanned the dark horizon and saw no shape yet. But something was there, something not human, not animal, and not machine, and the monitor on his wrist showed life signs that did not match any Earth pattern, and the signal was getting closer slowly, like it knew where to go and did not need to rush. He turned quickly and walked back into the shelter where the alien mother was, already holding her daughter close, and the memory stone floated between them with a strange quiet energy. And the little girl opened her eyes and whispered to Ray, "Is it time to leave?" And he looked at her and said, "Yes, but we must be fast and careful." Mother placed the stone inside a protective shell and gave it to Ray and said, "If anything happens, keep this safe, because if the stone is destroyed, our history will be lost forever." And Ray took it and placed it close to his chest and promised with a voice that carried more than words. Outside, the wind grew stronger and the sensors blinked red, and Ray activated the emergency exit hidden beneath a false floor and helped them climb down into a narrow tunnel once used for smuggling during old border wars, and the girl's hand held his tightly as they moved through the dark passage that smelled of dust and time. Above them, the shelter shook slightly and a low hum filled the air, and Ray knew whatever had found them was not here for peace and was not going to knock politely, and they had only minutes, maybe less, before the whole place was turned inside out. He reached the end of the tunnel and opened the exit hatch that led into a dry riverbed hidden under rock in silence, and helped them out one by one, and checked the scanner again and saw two life signs, now both non-human and moving fast, but still not visible to the eye. He guided them across the rocks to an old transport truck hidden under a camouflage net, and opened the back where supplies were packed, and told them to stay low and stay quiet. And he jumped into the driver's seat and powered the engine without lights and without sound, and the vehicle began to roll forward slowly like a ghost on wheels. As the truck moved across the valley, the stars above flickered once, and Ray glanced upward and saw something pass over them in the sky, not a ship, but a shadow with wings like glass, and a shape that seemed to bend around space. And he had seen many crafts in his life, but nothing like this, and it chilled his bones without even touching him. The girl peeked from behind the supply crates and whispered to her mother that she could hear the stars screaming, and the mother told her gently to close her mind and hold the stone and stay with the warmth, not the cold. Ray turned sharply down an old path and drove under a fallen rock arch and stopped the vehicle inside a cave, just wide enough to fit it and just deep enough to block signals. And he shut the engine and breathed out slowly, and for a moment there was only the sound of the desert wind howling far away. He turned to them and said, "We have to disappear completely, not just hide." And the mother nodded and said, "There is a place where they cannot follow us, but only if the child opens it." And Ray looked at the girl, who was now sitting calmly with the stone glowing brighter in her hands, and her eyes closed like she was dreaming with purpose. She began to hum softly a tune that made the air feel thick and warm, and the stone started to rise from her palms, and it spun gently and began to shine until the cave walls shimmered with light, and in front of them a circle of glowing dust formed slowly like a door made of memory and sound. Ray stared in awe as the portal became clearer, and through it he saw not stars, but something deeper, a space that looked like color and silence. And he asked, "What is this?" And the girl answered, "Home, not the world we lost, but the world we carry." Suddenly, a loud crash shook the valley, and a dark figure landed outside the cave with sharp feet and eyes that glowed like ice. And the hunter had arrived, and it began to move toward the cave with no fear and no sound. And Ray knew he had only seconds left. He turned to the mother and child and told them to go now through the portal and not look back. And the girl hesitated and asked, "What about you?" And Ray smiled sadly and said, "I will find you again, I promise." And he meant every word. They stepped into the light and disappeared as the stone faded behind them and the portal closed just as the hunter stepped inside the cave and stood face to face with Ray, who stood alone but not afraid and held his ground like a wall made of memory and fire. The cave was silent again, but far away on another world, a child looked at the stars and waited. The sky above the desert was dark and quiet, but deep in the sand were old tunnels twisted. Like forgotten veins, something older than fear was moving, and Ray walked slowly through the empty path with blood on his sleeve and fire in his heart, and behind him the memory of a portal closing like a door that might never open again. He had stood face to face with the hunter in the cave, and for one long moment neither moved and neither spoke, because the silence between them was not weakness, it was a test, and Ray had passed it not with strength, but with sacrifice, because he had bought time, and time was the only weapon he had left. The hunter had not chased the portal, it had looked at Ray and turned away as if knowing the girl was now out of reach, and the next step was to bring down everything connected to her, and Ray knew what that meant and what was coming, and that it would not stop now. He moved carefully across old ground and contacted an old friend through a broken signal, buried in encrypted layers, and waited for a voice, and when it came it was rough and familiar and full of history, and the voice said, "You're supposed to be dead," and Ray replied, "Not yet, but close." The voice belonged to Lena, a former soldier turned smuggler who once saved Ray's life in a war that didn't exist, and when he told her about the girl and the stone, she didn't ask many questions, because trust was not a thing they needed to build, it was a thing they never lost. She sent coordinates to an abandoned relay tower in the Badlands where no drones flew and no maps reached, and Ray made his way there in silence under skies that seemed to watch him with old eyes, and behind him, the hunter moved across the earth like a shadow that never lost the trail. Meanwhile, in a place far beyond the stars, the girl sat inside a shelter, shaped like a tree but made of light, and inside the walls memories flowed like wind, and the mother watched her daughter hum softly while the memory stone pulsed with a rhythm that seemed to change the air around them. The new world was not like the old one. It did not have cities or skies or oceans. Instead, it was a place of thought and feeling shaped by what the girl remembered and what she believed. And every corner held echoes of things long gone, and yet still alive inside the stone. She asked her mother if Ray would find them again, and the mother said yes, but only if he survived the hunter, and only if Earth did not betray him. And the girl closed her eyes and whispered something to the stone, and the stone shivered like it had heard something from far away back on Earth. Ray reached the tower and found Lena waiting with a small crew and an old ship patched together with faith and metal, and she hugged him once, then pulled away and said, "Tell me everything, and don't leave out the parts that scare you." He told her about the ship, the child, the memory, the portal, and the hunter, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long time, then said, "So we're running from something that doesn't stop and protecting something that might save us or destroy us?" And Ray said yes, and she smiled and said, "Sounds like old times." Together they planned a route to an old station hidden beneath a frozen lake where alien signals had once been recorded, and where a backup portal system might still exist if the power core had not failed, and if no one else had found it first. And the ifs were many, but they had no other way. The hunter reached the last shelter hours later and stood inside the cave where Ray had once stood, and touched the wall where the portal had opened, and from its claws came a spark that read the memory left behind, and inside that spark the hunter saw the girl and saw the future, and its voice echoed softly across the cave and said the child must not awaken. Then it turned and walked toward the frozen lake, because the trail was not cold yet, and the stone still called out like a whisper from another life. And the hunter followed with patience and with purpose, because it had hunted longer than time and failed only once. Ray and Lena flew low beneath clouds that felt like scars and passed old cities broken by silence, and arrived at the lake where the ice had cracked in strange patterns, and the entrance to the hidden station waited beneath. And they landed fast and entered with weapons ready and hope buried beneath caution. The station was cold and quiet, and the air was thick with dust, but the portal chamber still held a pulse, and Ray felt it as soon as he entered, like a heartbeat waiting to return. And the girl far away felt it too, and the memory stone in her hands grew warm. The hunter reached the edge of the lake just as the doors closed behind Ray and Lena, and the stars above blinked once as if warning the world that time was running out and the hunt was not over. And deep inside the memory stone, a new light began to stir. The frozen lake above groaned with ancient weight, while beneath the ice in the hidden station, Ray moved through metal corridors that whispered with forgotten voices, and the lights flickered like dying stars, as if the station itself remembered too much and wanted to forget. Lena walked beside him, silent and sharp, her weapon close, her eyes scanning every shadow, because something was wrong with the silence. It was too clean, too quiet, like the air was holding its breath, and Ray felt it too deep in his chest, where instinct lived without words. Reached the control room and saw the portal core still pulsing, slow and faint like a heartbeat, trapped beneath water, and Ray placed the memory stone near the core, and the light inside the stone reached out like fingers searching for a locket. Remembered, and the system responded with a soft hum, like a song waking from sleep. Screens flickered alive, and ancient alien code danced across them. And Lena said, "What now?" And Ray replied, "We open the gate, but not yet. We wait for the signal from her, from the girl, because she must guide it from her side, or it will collapse and take us all with it." Far beyond in the memory world, the girl sat near a circle of light, where stars moved like petals in wind, and her mother watched as the stone in the girl's hand glowed brighter and brighter. And then the girl said, "He's there, and he needs me," and her voice echoed across the strange sky like music touching time. She closed her eyes and whispered a song not made of words, but memory and love, and the stone began to spin faster and faster. And in the station, Ray felt the ground tremble gently, and the air changed, like it was remembering a place it had never seen. Portal core activated, and a ring of blue light opened slowly in front of them, not wide, not strong, but enough to send one, maybe two. And Lena looked at Ray and said, "This is it." And he nodded, but just as they prepared to step forward, a sharp cry cut through the station like metal tearing thought. The hunter had arrived, and its shape filled the corridor with darkness, not because it was large, but because it carried silence like a weapon and fear like a shadow. And Lena raised her weapon without hesitation and fired a pulse of energy, but it passed through the hunter like smoke through wind. Ray grabbed the stone and turned toward the portal, but the hunter moved like a blade cutting through space and blocked the path with eyes like frozen suns, and a voice that did not speak with sound, but with feeling. And it said the child must not awaken. Lena stood between them, her hand shaking, but her stance unbroken, and said, "If you want him, you go through me." And the hunter paused for a moment, as if remembering something long buried, then reached out with claws of light, but before it could strike, Ray stepped forward holding the stone high, and shouted her name, not the hunter's name, but the child's. And in that moment, the stone exploded with light. The station shook, and the walls rippled like liquid metal, and the hunter stumbled back as if the light had burned it from inside. And Ray saw something in its face for the first time. Not anger, not rage, but pain, and maybe regret. And it stepped away, slowly retreating into shadow. Lena grabbed Ray's arm and pulled him toward the portal, which now pulsed with wild energy. And Ray turned to her and said, "Thank you." And she smiled once and pushed him forward and stayed behind to guard the gate. And the last thing he saw before the light swallowed him was Lena standing tall in a storm of sparks. He landed in silence, surrounded by memory and dream. And there, in the soft world shaped by the girl's thoughts, he saw her waiting with the mother, and the sky opened above them like a blooming galaxy. And the girl ran to him and hugged him without fear, and the stone between them glowed pure. The mother looked at Ray with eyes full of peace and said, "You found the way." And Ray said, "No, she did." And the girl smiled and pointed to the sky where new stars were forming, and said, "We are not alone now." Back on Earth, the hunter stood alone in the broken station, staring at the empty portal and the light from the stone that still lingered in the air. and it did not chase, it did not scream, it only turned and walked away into the ice, leaving behind silence that would never forget. And far away in the world made of memory, a storm of stars danced slowly as the girl stood between what was lost and what was possible, and in her hands she carried more than light, she carried the future. The sky above the memory world shifted like water touched by wind, and in the center of it all stood the girl holding the stone close to her chest, while Ray and her mother watched the stars rearrange themselves into paths that had not existed before, and the air was filled with a strange calm, like the silence after a storm that never touched the ground. Ray looked around and saw not one world but many floating like bubbles in a sea of light, and each one pulsed with memory and story and possibility. And the girl walked slowly toward a glowing bridge that formed beneath her feet and said, "They are listening now, and they want to know who we are." The mother stood beside Ray and spoke softly, saying, "This is the heart of the stone, where past and future meet, and where choices become more than moments." And she looked at her daughter with eyes full of something more than pride, something deeper, something unbreakable. Ray asked, "What happens now?" And the girl replied with a smile like sunrise through clouds. She said, "We show them that fear does not win here, and pain is not our language." And then she reached out her hand and offered the stone to Ray and said, "It remembers you too now, and you must choose with us far away on Earth." The skies were no longer quiet, because the Empire's ships had arrived not with fire, but with presence, and they filled the upper atmosphere like a wall of warning, and every nation turned their eyes to the sky and waited for the end or the answer. Governments tried to talk to them, and scientists tried to send codes, but the ships did not respond. And then something unexpected happened. The alien ships projected an image across the sky, a memory, not theirs but hers, the girl's memory glowing in soft light across every city, and every eye saw the same thing. A child holding her mother's hand, standing in front of a broken world, whispering to the stars, asking not for power, not for revenge, but for home. And suddenly the silence of the Empire cracked like thin ice under fire, and from one of the ships a voice reached Earth and said, "We will listen, but we want the child inside the memory world." The girl heard it too, and her face grew still, and she looked at her mother and then at Ray and said, "They are afraid of what I might become." And Ray asked, "What will you become?" And the girl replied, "I do not know yet, that is the point." The mother stepped forward and said, "We can give her to them and maybe save this planet, or we can keep her safe and risk everything." And Ray looked at both of them and felt the weight of a choice that was never meant for one person, and yet somehow had always been his to make. He knelt down beside the girl and took her hand gently and said, "I cannot choose for you, but I will stand beside whatever choice you make." And the girl looked at the stars one last time and whispered, "I choose not to hide. I choose to be seen." The memory stone pulsed and split into 3 equal parts, one for her, one for her mother, and one for Ray, and the pieces glowed with a light that reached into the sky and through the air and across the universe. At every ship above, Earth saw it and felt it, and for the first time in generations, they paused. The Empire did not attack. They did not leave either, they simply waited, and in that pause something changed, not in the sky, but in the hearts of those watching, because they saw not a threat, but a child with courage, and they remembered what it meant to hope. Ray returned to Earth through the fading light of the portal with the mother and child beside him, and when they stepped onto the land no weapons were raised, and no orders were given, only silence and open hands. And the girl placed her piece of the stone on the ground and said, "This is for Earth to carry." Years passed and the memory world remained open, but protected not by walls, but by those who remembered what it had given. And Ray became a quiet name, a teacher of sorts, not of war, but of peace. And in the stories they told, the girl was not called an alien or a weapon. She was called the first light. And in a quiet valley far from the cities, a garden grew where the 3 pieces of the stone were buried side by side. And on nights when the wind was soft and the stars were clear, people swore they could hear the hum of something ancient and kind. The hunter was never seen again. But some say it still walks in silence, not hunting, but watching to make sure the light is never lost again. And the girl, now grown, still looks at the stars, not to escape them, but to guide others home, because in the end, the story was never about fear or power or war. It was about one small voice saying, "Please don't take my mommy," and one heart choosing to listen.